What's up, everyone? I'm Jared Harris, and welcome back to a brand new episode of Beats by Jer. Today, we'll be focusing on one of my favorite bands and their newest album, and its greater significance to that band's career, as well as the alternative rock genre as a whole. If the title of this episode didn't give it away, you guessed it, we're talking about Queens of the Stone Age in Times New Roman. Released on June 16th, 2023, this is a record that is going to change the alternative rock genre. It's very nostalgic for Queens of the Stone Age early work, back when they were pioneering this modern style of alt rock in the early 2000s. But it also somehow simultaneously feels like a culminating point that musically their previous two records had been leading up to. In Times New Roman is a record that will see Queens of the Stone Age reclaim their leading status as alt-rock trendsetters, as a band that continues to push the possibilities for a genre, and as a band that continues to raise the bar for what one should expect from alternative rock. This, of course, is a role that the band was a central part in throughout the early and late 2000s. And while it's hard to say that they necessarily fell from that position, the alt-rock genre has evolved since then. If anything, In Times New Roman is almost the soundtrack to a violent takeover of the alternative rock genre that sees Josh Homme and company stare down the style and commandeer it into something that feels nostalgic for two decades ago, and yet somehow feels incredibly modern, sleek, and polished. It's almost putting the genre into a chokehold and asserting their dominance and steering the course. And of course, this imagery, while incredibly dramatic, implies that they won this battle over alternative rock. That's entirely up to you. I think so. The record feels triumphant. The tour felt triumphant. It felt like such a victory lap for a band that has been out of the spotlight for a number of years. But melodramatics aside, I believe that In Times New Roman will be a very important record for the 2020s. In Times New Roman is the third record in a so-called trilogy that the band once referred to as on their social media. A trilogy that started with Like Clockwork in 2013, followed by Villains in 2017. While there are few, if really any, thematic crossovers between these records, there is an overarching darkness that kind of stems throughout the haunted and sort of twisted themes that come with Homme's lyricism and play on words and his outlook. And of course, there is the use of really out there, really cool alternative artwork from Boneface, who of course did the album designs for all three records. Really, if anything, this trilogy marks the third time around for this current lineup of the band, a band that has had many members come in and out and many collaborators work with them. However, the last three records have been predominantly the same core group. Of course, you have Josh Homme on lead vocals, guitars, piano, lead songwriting. You have Troy Van Leeuwen, the longest running member of Queens next to Josh, on guitars of all sorts, right? Double necks, lap steels, also playing keyboard, synths, percussions, backing vocals. Michael Schumann on bass, synths, and vocals again. Dean Farida, keyboards, synthesizers, some guitars here and there, percussion, additional backing vocals, and drummer John Theodore. This has been the lineup for these three records. This, to me, is what the band meant by a trilogy. And musically, it feels like a trilogy. These three records feel very apart from their previous albums, with the exception of In Times New Roman feeling incredibly nostalgic, yet somehow like the final act of these recent records. The album was born from a place of darkness, from a tremendous amount of loss, a series of unfortunate events that have plagued Hami since 2015, which of course predates the release of 2017's Villains, but of course these things they culminate. 2015, you had the Paris terrorist attacks at the Bataclan club in which Eagles of Death Metal were performing at. This, of course, being a band that Hami has recorded with, performed with. Some of his best friends are in this band, and while he was not present, this is obviously a traumatic event. This was then followed by the passing of Anthony Bourdain in 2018. And later Mark Lanegan, a previous member of Queens of the Stone Age, in 2022. Two figures in which Hami considers some of his closest friends. Since then, there has been an ongoing and very public divorce and custody hearing over Hami's children. And in the lead up to this record, he also revealed that he had actually been battling cancer in the last few years. Not a lot of great things going on, which really connects emotion to the tone of the record, the overall feel. If you want to hear more about these things, I would highly recommend listening to Hami's conversation with Zane Lowe, in which they kind of go through these different events. And it's one of the rare occasions where he actually, speaks about these things. And kind of reflects that into the songwriting. There's a particular moment where they kind of say it's almost an artist's job. How fortunate it is to be an artist, to be able to translate traumatic and heartbreaking events into something that can be productive and creative for oneself, but also for other people. It's a very unique conversation. It's very eye-opening to the record, and it's their ability to flip from talking about the passing of a best friend to cracking jokes. Their ability to just kind of flip and play off of each other. It's a very good conversation. I would also recommend Neil Brennan's The Blocks. He had Josh Homme on an episode of his podcast, and that's another really eye-opening one, particularly talking about Homme's addictions and how he's also overcome those in the last few years. Again, really influencing the tone of this record. With all that in mind, the resulting album is, the word that's being tossed around a lot is brutal. The band has used it to describe the record. I've seen an abundance of reviews that have used this word. It's a really interesting word because when you listen to rock music, when you listen to like really heavy music, when you listen to metal, we often associate the word with brutal as musically very heavy, right? Lamb of God is a brutal band. We don't often associate an alt-rock band like Queens of the Stone Age with the word brutal. I found this word very curious. Reading the early reviews before hearing the album, it kind of left me excited because I didn't expect the band to take a metal turn, which, I mean, spoiler alert if you haven't listened to it already, they didn't. And yet the word fits perfectly, right? It's a crushing album. It's thematically heavy, conceptually, tonally brutal. And in that, the band has found a creative way to express beauty amongst immense loss, amongst that brutality. It's truly a brutal album in that regard. It's a heavy album thematically, tonally, but not musically. It's important to note the lead up to the album was also a really interesting watch. As you know, if you've been listening to the last few episodes, I am a sucker for a really good press lead up into an album. To get hyped into a record is such an amazing feeling, and it's even better when you find that hype was justified and the album sticks the landing. The lead up for In Times New Roman, for starters, it was the band's first record since 2017. 6 years is a long time for a band, no matter how big, to go without releasing a new record. It's a long time for a band to be off the road. The news of a new Queens of the Stone Age album was obviously met with a lot of hype, a lot of excitement. The announcement was paired with a series of videos that short clips that featured distorted cuts of the audio from the songs, just enough to give you a hint of what to expect. But the imagery itself was very on brand for Queens of the Stone Age, a little weird, a little twisted, but really leaning into this ancient Roman theme, and using images that felt very mythological. The first one featured a topless woman with a snake and a tambourine as she's lip syncing Hami's words, and in front of her is a globe spinning on fire. There was another one with some sort of creature under a sheet, chained and roped up with a snake crawling around it, and horns like a minotaur almost protruding from this being, this creature. I don't know what it is. I'm still curious as to what it is. And of course, there was a third one which looks like, just this grandiose Roman party. There's a huge dinner spread. There's people in togas, and there's drinks, and there's drugs, and there's warriors and steroids. And if you can't tell by the way I'm listing these things, I'm watching the clip as I list. At first it's very clear as to what's going on, but as the clip goes forward, more and more oddities make their place and really disrupt the Roman mythology, right? The anabolic steroids in the syringes, the burgers that look like they're from McDonald's being picked up. It's all very weird, and I'm sure it's a statement on some of the backwards nature of some of our modern indulgences. But of course, as Hami is quick to point out in recent interviews, live on stage, they're not a political band, and he's not here to tell you what to do or think. That being said, the imagery is very compelling and very, very interesting. There's this darkly Roman occult kind of vibe to the imagery, to the album, to the lead up. And of course, this is furthered by the artwork, once again by Boneface. The blindfolded person wearing a Queens of the Stone Age jacket with these ghoulish hands wrapping around them, the wolf coming out of their hair, the wolf representing the mythology of Lupercalia, the she wolf, who sheltered and raised twins Romulus and Remus, who are part of the mythological foundation of Rome itself. And if you look closely, there are more snakes. Not a fan of snakes myself, but they're pretty cool the way they've been used in these videos and on the artwork. And the connection here being that the snake was often depicted in Roman art and jewelry, and it was a means of showing security and a family's prosperity, that likely originated from Macedonia. The belief in the sense that the snake had magical powers to influence fertility. And there you have it. There's a little ancient Roman history lesson thrown into this podcast. Of course, I would be remiss to not have mentioned the band's use of puns, something that I really enjoyed with this record. Of course, the album being In Times New Roman, but song titles including Obscenary, Paper Machete, Carnivoyer, What the Peephole Say, not people like you and I, but peephole, and Emotion Sickness. All of these just, they put a little smile on my face, and it kind of adds to that juxtaposition of mystery, of je ne sais quoi that Josh Homme has to him as a songwriter and as a being. It's such a dark and heavy album, and yet here we are What would the peephole say? It's funny. Well, the lead up and the imagery associated with the record is really unique, really enjoyable. Uh, Rock and roll and the occult just go so well together. The 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 purpose of this episode is to look at the musical significance of the record, and I think the best way to do that is a track by track breakdown of In Times New Roman. The album opens with Obscenery, a song that is, I would say, among the strongest on the record. It's this spacious verse. It's groovy. It's almost a dance beat, with a sparse riff that kind of embellishes on top of the bass and the drums. But the song really comes alive in the chorus, something that feels so intentionally claustrophobic, so tightly wrapped around you. It's overwhelming in its first listen, but not in a bad way. It's overwhelming in the sense that it challenges you to keep listening to it and almost decipher what's going on. The layering of the different guitars, synths, bass, drums, everything is just so tightly packed. And of course the tones, the guitar tones. This band has always been a band that has emphasized incredibly tasty tones, and this song showcases so much of them. And what very well could have been just a washed out, distorted chorus that had the same overwhelming effect with a wall of distortion, instead was this wall of sound that you could hear all the different elements if you really just crank the speakers a bit and listen to it. But it's so powerful. It's like a wave that just comes and pulls you in. You're going to listen to the rest of this album after hearing Obscenery. It's so beyond alternative rock. It's so beyond the band. It's so unlike anything else that has been done in the genre. This song in particular, I felt really saw Queens of the Stone Age challenging the possibilities for alternative rock. Paper Machete continues this idea, but in a more nostalgic direction. This song feels as though it could have been on Lullabies to Paralyze or Rated R. It feels like it immediately felt, when it was released as a single, like a classic Queens of the Stone Age song, a song that they'll be playing live for tours and tours to come. It's a pretty straightforward power chord riff, but the song doesn't relent in its energy. There's this sense of pent up anger, especially in John Theodore's drumming. You could really hear him like bashing into his China cymbal at particular parts. There's a lot here that feels so aggressive, and yet Hami's melodies are so sweet. They're so poppy. It's again that juxtaposition that we saw with, the artwork and the imagery, and then a silly pun like Paper Machete. It's what makes this song great. It's that push and pull between what could have been an aggressive punk rock song, but instead is led by a melody that is catchy, a melody that that plays to something that's just memorable and fun. While I can't speak for the record necessarily, it's also important to note that live, Troy played the guitar solo in Paper Machete, and I suspect he did play it on the record. But it's worth noting. It's a really cool solo. Negative Space is their most recent single, with a music video that came out after the album, just ahead of their North American tour dates. This song, chorus-wise, is probably the most conventional on the record. The verse is really cool. It's got this sort of strut to it. It's got this rhythmic riff with the bass and drums really playing with the space in between the guitar chords, either with Schumann adding these really fuzzed out bass runs, or Theodore playing around with his kick pattern. It's a really cool song, and it's this sort of trilogy of records has really emphasized a polished, refined sound to it, um, more control than chaos in the sense of allowing for artists to really musicians on record to kind of play out and add these little embellishments, these little licks, lead lines, fills, whatever you want to call them. This song in particular is one that it's really apparent that there's a little more of a chaotic nature to In Times New Roman. There's a lot more drum fills going on. There's a lot more lead lines from an abundance of guitars, the bass included, right? And there's a lot more going on with the synth in the space that's provided. Uh, it makes for, despite Negative Space being such a spacious song in at moments, it's, the album is very dense, and there is this really nice element of chaos added into what otherwise could have been a very refined record, similar to that of Villains. And of course, you can't forget about Hami's harmonized vocals in the verse. It's so, that falsetto with that higher baritone register going on together. It's such a combination. It's so signature of him, and yet it feels so new on this record. I would say Negative Space has some of his best vocals on the album. Time and Place is a really cool song. Musically, it's propelled by this polyrhythmic thing going on in the guitar. What I really enjoy about the song is that you can really hear all three guitar parts because they're all playing different things at any given moment. One of them, however, is this 2-bar polyrhythmic refrain, and it goes throughout the entire song. Live, Troy played it with Josh picking up some of the other rhythmic interludes of guitars, and Dean playing the solo on this song. But it's this polyrhythmic pulse that goes underneath everything, and it runs the entire length of the song. It's so challenging. It's so it's so unique, and what could have been, a gimmick like that was played at one point. They drew it out so long that it took a life of its own, and it feels like the central aspect of the song itself. It's a really cool exercise in rhythm and polyrhythms without feeling like you're, nerding out to a progressive rock song. Made to Parade is this punishingly sludgy riff. It's such a heavy song, and yet the chorus is not, right? The vocals actually use an effect on them that make them sound like they're in the distance, sometimes coming through an old radio. It's a weird display of songwriting to make the verse larger than the chorus. You typically would do that on a song that is not necessarily going to be a single, right? Because singles are built around massive choruses. This in itself feels like a rejection of that idea because the chorus is so weird. It's so obscure. The melody of the chorus is strange. The vocal effects are strange. And the verse is just larger than life, so obnoxious. And again, playing on those juxtapositions that were in Paper Machete, the riff is so aggressive, and then in between a chorus and a verse, you have this almost sing-songy synth line. It's a little percussive, but it feels very animated with life. It feels very cheerful, and really conflicts with the heaviness of the riff and the hauntingly offbeat chorus. The second single released for the record, Carnivore, is another central piece to the album. It is somehow the most beautiful song on the record and the most desolate. It's this spacious, modern, psychedelic song led by synths, and it's it's so haunting. It's so unlike anything else the band has really released. It's a really cool song. And when the guitars do take the lead, they often feel like they're cutting through the sonic atmosphere. They're just ripping through everything else, and they're overpowering the vocals. Hami's use of vocal harmonies is what adds this level of beauty to this otherwise terribly terribly dark song. It's a really cool piece of music. It's really something entirely unique, and I would say it is the center of what makes this album so fantastic. It adds just a little splash of versatility. In some ways, you could consider it to be the ballad on the album, despite it not being a ballad. It's almost like a tonal ballad, right? It's a little slower. It's a lot more spacious. It really plays with empty and near empty space, not in a way that the other songs have, like space in between a riff, but just using space as a canvas to paint upon. Reflecting on this song, I think of two quotes from two very different songwriters, but such important ideas. The first comes from Keith Richards, who said, "A painter's got canvas, the writer's got reams of empty paper, a musician has silence." And similar in tone, but a little more to the point, Miles Davis once said, "In music, silence is more important than sound." I think Carnivore really plays to that, right? Using space, using silence as a means of accenting this quiet to loud dynamic, as a means of highlighting something that feels introspective, something that feels vulnerable, but also creating almost a sense of suspense. And the song, it builds and builds and builds, and the ending is something that comes out of nowhere. It's this building rhythmic refrain that explodes to be one of the loudest moments on the album. When reflecting on the idea of this album being a trilogy, What the People Say might be the song in which holds the greatest connection to previous records, particularly its similarities in style, tone, music to Head Like a Haunted House on Villains. It's a super upbeat, super fun song. It's a great song. It's probably among the lesser tracks on the album. But with an album this strong, I would say that there are no weak tracks, just tracks that are good. And to me, What the People Say is a song that's good. It's fun. I don't skip it, but it doesn't quite hold up to the level of excitement and intensity as the other songs. It almost feels a little out of place with just how lighthearted it feels. But of course, that in itself might be why it was included. That might be the significance it plays on the record in the sense that it, similar to Carnivore, it adds a tonal balance to the song. It adds something that through lightness you get to appreciate the remaining darkness of the album, right? It might simply be the missing piece that the album needed to really get its point across. And of course, the song speaks to Hami's mantra of being able to do whatever it is you want to do, of expressing individuality, of seeking creativity, of harmless mischief. Something which he talks extensively about on Zane Lowe and The Blocks. Just this idea that he's not going to tell you what to do, and in fact he wants to create a space that you can do whatever you want within reason. He expressed this at their Toronto show, right, saying that he wasn't up there to dictate or tell us what to do or how to conduct ourselves. He just said that we need to watch out for each other, and this is a space where they're going to put the lights a little low and let us do our thing. And he talks about this on Zane Lowe, right? The idea that he has this idea of not ever wanting to tell people to do and to let everyone express themselves however they want. But there are these hard lines that he also has. It's a really fascinating conversation and certainly worth listening to. What the people say lyrically connects to this immensely, and that might also be why it fits as a central piece on this album. Up next might very well be my favorite song off the album, a song that is the least likely to be a single. It has the least mass appeal to it. Sicily is such a twisted, such an amazing exercise of creativity. The song is so unlike anything else and yet so distinctive to that of Queens of the Stone Age. The verse is just loose percussion. It's probably a jam block, but it might sound like two bottles and finger snaps, a sparse kick drum that really kicks deep, but is used sparsely, and a bass guitar that feels reminiscent of Primus, but particularly their Primus and the Chocolate Factory album, an album which didn't get a lot of love or attention, but is such a weird piece of music. I love it so much. You have this stage set, this very sparse and empty soundscape of just bass and light percussion, and Hami is just almost whispering over it. And the chorus erupts in this riff that's played on guitar and synth, and it's such a cinematic feeling melody. And the first chorus doesn't even have vocals. It's the melody of it sounds almost as though Hami had tasked himself with writing a James Bond song, but in traditional fashion, could never be satisfied with something that conventional, that clean. And there's just this hint of Bond in this riff, but it feels so psychedelic and so haunting. It feels like if Bond fell into an Alice in Wonderland sort of hellhole with things melting and shrinking and growing around him. It feels like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. You could see the room around the band is fluctuating in time and space. You could see the walls melting around them as their instruments crumble. It's such a strange song. I'm astounded it made it onto the album. I love it so much. It's one of the most creative pieces of rock music I've heard in some time. It's so bizarre and dark and demented, and it's captivating in the way that it is unlike anything else you would expect from anyone ever. And when the vocals do finally come in the second chorus, they're almost mumbled, they're muffled, it's more of a whisper, just less of a falsetto whisper. It's startling. It feels almost like you're looking into their studio space behind the curtain that you're not supposed to peer behind. It feels unfinished in some ways. It's such a unique song. There's a guitar solo in there that feels like a work in progress, and somehow all of this works. It shouldn't, but it does, and it's stunning. And playing off that idea of peering behind a curtain, the next song, Emotion Sickness, starts with Hami just humming the melody, but you can hear what sounds almost like a door creaking open, like you're walking into a next room out of the Sicily space, but into this room that is again, you're not supposed to be there. This song, of course, was the lead single for the album, so it takes um, a much more conventional approach in comparison, and similar to Paper Machete, it already feels like a classic Queens of the Stone Age song. The verse is led by this rhythmic starting and stopping riff. Again, it's a little overwhelming. It's all so in your face, and the chorus is so lush and catchy and sing-songy. It's this juxtaposition that I keep talking about. It's something that Hami has mastered. It's something that's so signature to his sound. It makes sense why it's the lead single, and yet it doesn't necessarily play by the rules which one would expect from the first single back from a band that hasn't put out music in 6 years. It's not larger than life. It's not grandiose. It's not the heaviest song on the album. It's not the one with the shreddiest solo. In terms of a big return, in terms of a single, it sounds like a single, but it doesn't sound like the single you would intentionally release when making a return. And somehow it worked for the band, right? It stoked the flame, and it created such a wave of excitement for the album. The album closes with Straight Jacket Fitting, a 9-minute blues shuffle, but not your traditional blues. A song that it was pulled out of the desert. It was pulled out of those valleys that the band themselves are from. It's the blues played out of Joshua Tree. It's so dark, and it's almost not the blues, but it's a 9-minute song. The chorus in itself has this hint of it that connects it to the closing tracks from Like Clockwork and Villains. Of course, the title track being Like Clockwork and Villains of Circumstance. I'm sure you can figure out which album has which song, but there's a hint of pop, almost disco, to those songs, particularly in the chorus, right? And Straight Jacket Fitting has that, right? This sludgy, grimy, dirty verse that drags itself into this chorus that's not quite uplifting. It's not quite the resolution that comes from, there is no real happy ending to this album, but it has a chorus that is exciting and is almost danceable. It's such a weird push and pull. And for whatever reason, the song fades into this acoustic musing at the end. It's just like 2 minutes of acoustic guitars with a slight electric slide going on there, droning behind it, and it's almost like a soft goodbye, right? Almost like a little palate cleanser, knowing this is among their heaviest records, among their most brutal records. Just this soft little piece that says they're going to be okay. It's a little reassurance, almost a nod as they're heading out the door that says, "Thanks for listening. We're all right." I caught the band on the second night of their North American tour, August 4th, at Toronto's Budweiser stage. The show was incredible. I've seen Queens of the Stone Age 3 times prior before, and they always put on an incredible performance. Again, largely rooted in just their sound, their tones. Everything is so curated. Everything sounds so incredible, and shout out to their front of house sound guy, who just, the team they work with, because of course this comes down to the instruments they play, how they play them, the amps they use, all of that, the pedals. But there is an element to a Queens of the Stone Age show that relies on having an engineering team that can help deliver the sounds as they deserve to be heard. It's what makes a Queens of the Stone Age show unlike anything else. It just sounds, whether you like the band or not, it's going to be one of the most impressive sounding concerts, rock shows that you'll ever see. Heading into the show, Hami had made headlines leading up to this tour, with his disdain for artists who refuse to play their hits or who begrudgingly do so. Paraphrasing, he says it's a little "see you next Thursday" of the artist. And that in itself raises a really interesting discussion of, the question being, do artists owe their lifestyle and their opportunities to express and explore their creativity to the fans? And in that case, in owing something, is there some sort of responsibility that artists have when on tour to perform some of these songs and to do it, with a smile on their face? That in itself is an entirely different discussion, but it certainly set the tone for this show. The hits were performed, right? And among that, almost half of the new record as well, which is always a nice vote of confidence from the artist that they're putting a stamp of approval on their work, in the context that they believe that their new album can stand beside the hits, the reason that you are there. I always like it when a band performs their new material. Of course, you want to see the hits, but the reason you keep going back is to hear new songs, different songs, and to hear things performed differently, and to hear new songs in the same context as the hits, to hear like Paper Machete next to No One Knows and be like, yeah, this rips, it's awesome. It's such a good feeling when you've invested so much of yourself into a band that you love. Highlights from the show included an unexpected and impromptu performance of "You Think I Ain't Worth a Dollar, But I Feel Like a Millionaire." The song was on a sign that was shaped like, I guess, $1 million on a $100 bill or whatever, and it had a kid's face on it, and it was passed up to Hami after he called out for it. They played through the song. They had to, they had their techs come on stage and switch out the instruments because they were not expecting to play it, which kind of adds to the authenticity of the moment. And Hami, obviously not knowing the person that he was dedicating this song to that night, decided to say that this song's for you, Derek. And, in that case, shout out to Derek. Definitely made a special moment for everyone hearing a song that, and quite honestly, I wasn't expecting to hear that night. Additionally, however, the band dedicated a song to Lanigan. They performed "God Is in the Radio" and included something that felt like a 10-minute impromptu jam with swelling guitars, the use of ambient space, and drums that would almost violently erupt through the silence. It was such a, considering this isn't really a band that tends to improvise much on stage, right? It was really a really interesting moment to see something added into the set. And of course, it was something added because Hami expressed on stage that they're not going to go away and do the encore thing. He says that feels fake now that they've done it so many times. We know they're coming back. They know they're coming back. He's just there to play, which speaks to the whole ethos of the event, the entire mantra that I've talked about throughout this. The idea that Hami is there to create a space for people to do whatever they want, and he's here to spread joy and play music, something that he expressed on stage, and something that was also represented through the Queens Coliseum tailgate pre-show party. This was just a really cool event. They've done it at a few other dates since, where they have local vendors, bookstores, record stores, clothing stores, setting up booths. You've got food trucks. The radio stations were all there, of course. They had DJ Waves performing and supporting some of the performative events going on, which included burlesque and a wet t-shirt contest. There was a bus where there was live tattooing. It was such a cool event that just drew you in and made this concert feel something so special. I'd be very interested to see other artists take the idea of a pre-show party, a pre-show hang, and run with it as a means of making concerts all that more engaging and exciting. It's definitely a way that you can do that for the future. All around, 10 out of 10 concert, 10 out of 10 album. It's truly an exciting time to be a fan of Queens of the Stone Age. And perhaps it's the use of ancient mythology. I know it's Roman, but my connection goes back to Greek mythology. Without word as to why they had left, and no word on when they would return, there is a sense of homecoming surrounding In Times New Roman and Queens of the Stone Age current tour. It's almost, mythologically speaking, like the return of the Odyssey. We don't know where they went. We don't know what depths they went to find the inspiration for In Times New Roman, nor do we know what untold events, untold creatures they faced to find this inspiration. But watching Hami stumble across the stage, maybe drunk, maybe not, but to do so elegantly, almost like a Captain Jack Sparrow, right? To watch him, this man whose hair has grown out, his bearded goatee pointed and almost sinisterly, to watch this salty old sea dog who's lost his land legs long ago return victoriously, triumphantly. It's truly a special affair. And again, I'm reading into the mythology and making these connections to more mythology that isn't present, but it's a little bit fun to imagine this, to imagine Hami setting sail into the unknown and returning successfully with his motley crew. But of course, musically, there is a significance to this album that makes it more meaningful to the genre of alternative rock. It is not just a meaningful album to the band. This is a major moment for the genre as a whole. It's important to remember that Queens, as an alt-rock band, throughout the 2000s directed the sound of the genre with records like Rated R, Songs for the Deaf, Lullabies to Paralyze. They truly were innovators of a sound, of a vibe, of an entire era, a generation, if you will, of alternative rock. And even further, Hami did this more as a producer and as a collaborator. He's worked with the likes of Arctic Monkeys, Iggy Pop on Post-Pop Depression, The Hives. He's contributed to music from the Foo Fighters, The Strokes, Royal Blood, Mark Lanegan, Biffy Clyro, Lady Gaga, Run the Jewels, right? I know those last two, it's more alternative pop and alternative hip hop, but just this overall sense of alternative music is kind of just running through Hami's veins. And then, of course, you have his work with Dave Grohl, John Paul Jones, the incredible, the perfect standalone, Them Crooked Vultures. Queens of the Stone Age, Josh Homme, they have truly, truly directed 2000s alternative rock. The 2010s saw the genre go in a more refined direction, right? Bands like the 1975 are a reflection of that, something that's more almost pop oriented, still band like, but it's got this electronic element. It's alternative. It's different from mainstream rock. It's different from mainstream pop. There's the last decade saw the alternative rock genre almost diluted, in the sense that anything that just didn't fit in kind of got shoved in there. Whereas in the 2000s, there was a definitive alt rock sound. In the 90s, there was a definitive alt rock sound. And it's not as though Queens of the Stone Age tried to follow trends for the first time, but like Clockwork and Villains had a sense of refinement to them, right? There was a certain polished edge to these records. There was something that felt a little more, not necessarily commercial, but a little more commercial compared to something like Songs for the Deaf. In Times New Roman feels like an extension of these records, an extension of that 2010 sound, except it feels like it's been flipped on its head. It feels very nostalgic for the 2000s sound. It's dangerous. It's reckless. It has this unpredictability, this sense of chaos and danger. It's so abundant. It's so tangible on this album. It feels like the band is returning to their roots, but also returning to a position where they are steering the course of what alternative rock could sound like in the 2020s. Back in setting the pace, returning as trendsetters and leaders of a sound. That to me is what In Times New Roman represents. Between the songwriting, between the performance on the album, between this return to form, I am so confident in calling that this is the album of the year. In Times New Roman is such a powerful piece of music. It's such a fantastic record, and it's so exciting. It's so thrilling to see Queens of the Stone Age back where they belong. The band shared a photo from a recent show, and there was a sign held up in the audience, and I couldn't think of a better way to phrase this than to borrow what was on the sign. All hail the Queens. Follow me on Instagram and TikTok at Beats by Jer. Let me know what you thought of In Times New Roman and the triumphant return of Queens of the Stone Age. I'm Jared Harris, and this has been Beats by Jer.